Professional wrestling is a deceitful business. The whole thing is based on, well, lying, really. I mean, if you think about it, companies are going out there and they're trying to put on a show. They're trying to convince you that the oily spandex fight going down in the ring is a real fight. But it goes much deeper than that as well, with backstage politics, shady carny tactics and selfish money-grabbing behaviour as big a part of the sport as anything that goes down in the ring. And sometimes the cheekiest scamps of all are the wrestlers themselves. And the people I'm going to talk about today are prime examples of craftiness in action. Sometimes the independent contractor works the independent contractee. I'm Andy for What Culture Wrestling, and here are 10 wrestlers who purposefully deceived promoters. Number 10. The Junkyard Dog. Right in the middle of a 1984 run on top in Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling, JYD bolted to the WWF because, you know, money, leaving the cowboy absolutely fizzing. Jim Ross wrote in his second book that after this, Watts would repeatedly rant about the dog and about how he'd upset the apple cart by walking out when he'd already agreed to be booked in main event programs for the foreseeable future. Big Bill just couldn't believe that JYD would do business that way, especially when Mid-South had given him so much and turned him into a bankable star. Junkyard Dog seemingly neither cared nor wanted to clue Watts in. He was too interested in making a bigger name for him on the WWF's grander platform, and obviously wanted to be part of McMahon's bold national expansion. Those were opportunities that perhaps didn't exist in Mid-South, so it's kinda hard to blame him, really. 9. Boris Zhukov. The AWA was already reeling when Boris Zhukov decided to leave without notice and join the WWF in 1987. Now, the main problem with that is that he was one half of the tag team champions, and his departure left the company in the willies. Scrambling, the AWA put Doug Summers in Zhukov's place and hoped for the best. To Vern Gagne, it was a complete slap in the face that Zhukov would leave without dropping the belts, or, you know, like, telling him? Zhukov didn't give a hoot. He quickly formed the Bolsheviks with Nikolai Volkov, and together they became one of the top heel tag teams in the WWF. He must have known all along that Vince McMahon was headhunting him, but he chose not to let Gagne know. Number 8. Joey Janella. Joey Janella admitted to Sean Mooney on the Primetime podcast that he used to lie to promoters all the time during his first few years in the business. Why? Well, Janella wanted to portray himself as an experienced hand who could do anything they needed on their card. Of course, it was a ruse. It was a big fat lie. The literal rookie didn't have any of the experience he claimed, but promoters didn't need to know that. All they needed to know was that this was a young, charismatic up-and-comer who was a hot property, and if they missed out on him, they'd be fools. And somehow, the attitude worked, and the bookings flooded in. Promoters would ask Joey if he could sell tickets for them in the arenas that he'd previously worked. He said yes, knowing fine and well that he'd never even worked these arenas at all, and he didn't sell any, but still managed to scrape by unnoticed. An incredible grift from a man who has now made it relatively close to the top in All Elite Wrestling. Number 7. The Boogeyman. The Boogeyman knows a thing or two about lying his worms off. Let's go back to Tough Enough 4. Marty Wright, the man behind the gimmick, decided to tell WWE when he auditioned and when he took part that he was 30 years old. Now, this was an outright lie. Wright was actually 40 years old, which is a full 5 years older than the 35-year-old cutoff point. And the only reason WWE found out about this was because they asked to see his ID. Big Marty was cut from the competition immediately, and from there, he could have become a laughingstock. However, somewhat unbelievably, WWE hired him after this, and he went on to play the nightmarish character of the Boogeyman on TV for years. That's right, not even lying to WWE and minusing 10 years from his age could stop Marty from getting a WWE contract. But maybe that had something to do with him getting signed, come to think of it. I mean, that's so goddamn audacious, you just have to admire it, really. And later, as we know, Marty bagged a lucrative gig and a lengthy on-off run with a niche gimmick. Shame all those worms had to die in his name though. Really tragic stuff. Number 6. Ric Flair. Ric Flair surely knew that WCW would seek legal action once he showed up on WWF television with the promotion's world title. When he did, he claimed that he'd never been repaid the 25 grand deposit the NWA champions had to part with to hold Big Gold, and he thought he was therefore free to do whatever the hell he wanted with the title. In reality, Ric was keen to stick it to his old employer any which way he could. He had been left incredulous when WCW chief Jim Herd pitched that he, 1, take a pay cut, and number 2, shave his head, wear an earring, and become Spartacus instead of Ric Flair. That's a real thing that almost happened. Now, in Flair's mind, it was time to have some fun, so that's why he took the belt to the competition. Flair decided that he just wasn't going to inform WCW that he still had the title, and nor did he feel the need to inform them that he was going to the WWF. Instead, Ric just showed up on Vince McMahon's TV show and proclaimed himself the real world champion just to be a scamp. Look at his face. Number 5. Medusa. When reigning WWF Women's Champion Alundra Blaze showed up on WCW Nitro, the first thing she did was drop Vince McMahon's belt in the bin. The rebranded Medusa felt disrespected by the WWF, and though she later admitted that she wasn't entirely on board with the stunt, she went along with it anyway. Vince McMahon obviously had no idea that she was going to put the belt in the bin, but when he let her go as part of a cost-cutting exercise, he had no idea she was going to WCW either, although, come on man, it was the Monday Night Wars! Probably should have seen that one coming. But, you know, if we're being honest, Vince probably didn't even think that much about the bloody thing when he canned Blaze in late 95, and he certainly didn't expect her to be so brazen as to do something like this. The move got her blacklisted from WWE for 20 years, so was it worth it? Blaze doesn't think so. She calls it the biggest mistake of her career. Number 4. Rick Rude. The Ravishing One pulled a fast one on promoters twice during his legendary career. In 1987, he was an NWA Tag Team Champion working primarily for Jim Crockett Promotions, with Manny Fernandez his partner, forming the Awesome Twosome. Unfortunately, the tandem was forced to disband when Rude went off to the WWF without telling anyone, killing any chance of the duo's feud with the Rock and Roll Express having any kind of conclusion. Around 10 years later, Slick Rick was at it again when he traded the WWF for WCW. Much to everyone's surprise, Rude appeared on Nitro with a mustache and criticised Vince McMahon, DX and many others. Approximately 1 hour later, Rude also appeared on Raw without his facial hair. He became the first man to perform on Raw and Nitro on the exact same night. Angered by the events of the Montreal Screwjob, Rude had used his contractual freedom and pay-per-appearance deal in the WWF to ink terms with Eric Bischoff and WCW behind Vince McMahon's back. Number 3. Brian Pillman. Eric Bischoff got some healthy deception of his own when Brian Pillman ingeniously convinced many in the pro wrestling sphere that he'd lost his damn mind. His loose cannon character blurred the lines between fantasy and reality so well that even those close to him totally bought it. And then came Pillman's masterstroke. He persuaded Bischoff that folks would only keep buying into this persona if WCW genuinely let him go from his contract. He got what he wanted, and from there, he merrily danced off to the WWF and played both companies against each other during negotiations with Vince McMahon, who was only too happy to snag a potential star from his competition. Pillman even got a brief stop off in ECW in '96 before joining the Fed full time. The way he manipulated WCW and used the Monday Night Wars as a tool to add value to his deal was something else. You gotta admire the hustle, really. You certainly can't knock it, Jay-Z. Number 2. Lex Luger. WCW knew they needed something mega for the debut edition of Monday Nitro in September 95. The company wanted to make headlines. Eric Bischoff jumped at the chance to flex his muscles and sign Lex Luger behind closed doors. When Lex the Flex walked out into public view on Nitro in that weird shopping centre thing, most people thought he was still a WWF wrestler, so the wrestling world stood still. Shockwaves! But how was this possible? The WWF took their goddamn eyes off the bloody ball. That's how it's possible. They failed to even notice that Luger's contract had lapsed, and he seized the moment. 24 hours after working a WWF house show in Canada, Lex handed Bischoff the moment he craved, and the WCW boss ranted and raved about how Nitro was home to all of wrestling's biggest stars. Luger showed up without even tipping Vince McMahon that he was leaving the company. That helped turn his WCW re-debut into a killer moment, because he'd never work for the WWE again. Number 1. Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash knew that WCW were probably not going to let him out of his contract if he said he was going to go over to the WWF and hang out with Shawn Michaels. So, unbeknown to everybody, Nash purposefully lied to Ole Anderson and said that he was just sick and tired of wrestling as a whole, when really he just wanted to try his luck elsewhere. So WCW, those silly sausages, let Nash go on the assumption that he was going to go back to being a nightclub bouncer. And then he signed with WWF, and oh boy. Amazingly, Nash's last match, a tag team match as Vinny Vegas with Big Sky against the Cole Twins on Worldwide, aired after he'd already made his WWF debut alongside HBK in June '93. With Michaels, the renamed Diesel found his feet and would eventually become a world champion less than 18 months later. So in conclusion, Kevin was talking pish when he told Ole the reason he wanted out of his contract. That was a lie. He didn't want the grumpiest man in wrestling to smell that he was going to WWF, and it worked an absolute charm. Nash returned to WCW 3 years later, of course, for massive money, because Kevin Nash always wins. So that's our list, but what do you guys reckon? And can you think of any more? Let us know down in the comments section below. After you've done that, you can like, you can share, you can subscribe, you can do whatever the hell you want, cause I'm not your dad. I think. Then you can follow us on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE and myself at Andy H. Murray, where you can tell me how wrong I am. Piss off!